Hi everyone. In this presentation, we are going to be going over the history of language in the United States from 1970 through the Every Student Succeed Act. To begin our discussion, let's go ahead and review our topic objective. For this content presentation, our objective is students will review major world and U.S. historical events, litigation, and federal policies that have impacted ESL bilingual education. So keep that in mind as we are going through the content. All right, to start off, let's review very quickly what we discussed in our last content presentation. So in 1964 was the introduction of the Civil Rights Act, and Title VII, which is the non-discrimination clause, is cited quite a bit in litigation for ESL bilingual education. And with the Civil Rights Act, we want to remember that it extends to, it was based, yes, on race, but it also extends to religion, race, ethnicity, language, ability. It kind of covers discrimination as a whole. And so, again, with this Civil Rights Act, it banned discrimination based on race, sex, color, and national origin in public facilities. And so we're going to see a lot of landmark discrimination cases go back to the Civil Rights Act, and the rulings are going to be based on the fact that there was an infringement of the rights protected under the Civil Rights Act. So just kind of keep this in mind as we go forward, because this is cited a lot in cases concerning language ability. We also saw in 1964 with President Johnson's quote-unquote war on poverty and his aim to not only relieve symptoms of poverty, but to cure it and above all prevent it. And so with this, he introduced legislation that brought about the Social Security amendments, food stamps, Economic Opportunity Act, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Within this act, the important things to remember are that Title I focused on the needs for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, so it provided federal funding for specifically this population of students. And then a little bit after the initial act, we see Title VII being added, which is the Bilingual Education Act. So with ESA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, remember that there were 4 reauthorizations before it eventually was put to rest in 2001. And then again, the Bilingual Education Act came 3 years after the first draft of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. So it's important to remember that with the Bilingual Education Act, there were a lot of broad policies, but keep in mind again that if it hadn't been for these broad policies, it's not really understood, or it can be debated of whether or not the act would have actually been put into place in the first place, if it would have been accepted from more conservative lawmakers. So in 1968, for the first time in United States history, we saw bilingual education actually protected under a part of federal policy. And so in 1968 was the original act. Then there were reauthorizations in 74, 78, 84, 88, and 94. And then also it was put to rest in 2001, and both the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Bilingual Education Act were replaced by No Child Left Behind, which we will discuss here in just a little while. All right, so let's go ahead and get our conversation started. For this content presentation, what we're going to be reviewing more than anything is not so much world events anymore, but more so key litigation and policies that happened from 1970 and beyond. Now that the Civil Rights Act is in place, as well as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Bilingual Education Act, you're going to see a lot of litigation start to come up because these federal policies are in place and protecting the rights of language learners specifically, but really all citizens and students from minority populations. These lawsuits are going to start coming about because these key pieces of litigation give the lawsuits and give the cases like federal grounding, something to establish themselves in. There's actually federal policy that can be cited that's being violated. One of the first cases was in 1970, and this case was Diana versus the state of California. And so just a quick case overview, and then we'll discuss the results and how this affected bilingual education. And this is going to be how we discuss all key pieces of litigation that concern bilingual education. So with this case, there were a group of 9 Mexican-American Spanish-speaking students in the state of California. And when students come into schools, they're back in the 70s, the standard test for intelligence testing was just a standard IQ test. So this group of 9 Mexican American Spanish-speaking students were given an IQ test upon their entry in school, but the IQ test was actually in English. And so because of this, they scored very low. Because of their low score, they were then placed in special education classes. Now, at the time, just like with bilingual education, we have to remember that with special education, it was still developing. So when we're talking about special education classes, it's not what special education classes look like today. Back in the 70s, special education classes really housed all students with special needs. So you may have had dyslexic students, and then students with just minor cognitive disabilities, and then all the way to students with like cerebral palsy and severe cognitive and physical disabilities. So everybody was in the same room. So you had these 9 Mexican American Spanish-speaking students placed in special education courses and in classes, and kept out of, at the time in the 70s, again, inclusion was not a thing. And so they were kept out of general education classes because of this. So that's how the complaint came about. The judge actually ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, in favor of the Mexican American students, stating that students needed to be tested in their native language to avoid errors in classification. And this is really important, and this is still a misconception that's being dispelled today, is that language ability somehow means a lack of cognitive ability. And it's not that. If students are tested in their native language, you're able to see just how much more academically they have achieved up to this point. There's a lot of research that targets dispelling learning errors for language errors. Sometimes people who aren't familiar with the process of language acquisition think that students are cognitively disabled in some way or another, and it's not necessarily that. It's just that they may have the processing of information may be different in their native language. So because of this, this really was a landmark case that helped to set a legal precedent for standards for testing English learners. And with this, it said that students need to be tested in their native language. And secondly, additional testing needed to be utilized to determine placement in special education programs. It's very important when you're testing English learners for the possibility of receiving special ed services or not, to be very thorough with your testing. If an English learner is placed in a special education classroom and they shouldn't be in there, if they are wrongfully classified, they will actually begin to regress in their language ability as well as their academic achievement. So they will start to fall behind because they're not placed in the correct classroom. So this is why it's really, really important at this with this case to understand that this set this precedent. And again, this is still being fought today. Not everybody understands the process of language acquisition, nor should we expect them to. But with the population of English learners that we have in the country, it's important to know and understand why we take such care, such careful time, and why we invest so much time in testing them. Because again, wrongful classification can really have these long-term effects for students. So in 1970, 6 years after the original passing of the Civil Rights Act, there was a civil rights memo drafted and issued. This was issued by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for the implementation and compliance of Title VI, which is non-discriminatory and equal access to education. So Title VII targeted non-discriminatory actions in public facilities. Title VI specifically addressed equal access to education and non-discriminatory acts in education and public education. So the 1970 Civil Rights Memo specifically outlined the responsibilities of schools and districts with the implementation and compliance of making sure that there were non-discriminatory practices happening in their school districts. The Civil Rights Memo was extended to anyone receiving federal funding, and with this, if schools and districts and state educational organizations, if they were receiving federal funding, they were required to take affirmative steps to correct any kind of language deficiency for students. So this Civil Rights Memo, just like the Bilingual Education Act, had very broad policies to ensure that schools and districts and states receiving federal funding were actually taking steps to make sure that the language needs of bilingual education programs, the language needs of English learners were being met. It was just still very broad. Again, these affirmative steps to correct language deficiency, that can mean a lot of things. But again, it's questionable as to if there was something very prescriptive in here. If there were, for example, steps saying, okay, you can only use these programs, it's questionable of whether or not that litigation would have actually gone through. So again, this broad definition does work against bilingual education in some ways, but others saw it as well. It's kind of better than nothing. The civil rights memo, which included Title VI, is often utilized in litigation concerning English learners. So you're going to see it referenced in several cases coming up as well. So in 1972, we have the case of Serna v. Portales, and it's actually Portales, New Mexico, the independent school district there. This case is actually one of the first cases that arose concerning bilingual education, but outside the context of desegregation. So the case wasn't so much based on desegregation, but rather the services that the students in the school were receiving. The parents of the students claimed that the school was not serving the needs of students with Spanish last names. That was indicative of the ethnicity of the students. And thus, they were saying that their rights protected under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that we just discussed were being violated. And the judge actually ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, in favor of the parents and the students who rose the complaint, and found that schools were actually in violation of their protected rights under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The school district of Portales, New Mexico tried to appeal the ruling in 1974, but was unsuccessful. So you'll see this case come up in 72 and then appealed, but unsuccessfully appealed in 74. Again, the judge did find that the school district of Portales, New Mexico was underserving students. And so in his ruling, he stated that it was incumbent on school districts to reassess and enlarge its programs directed to the specialized needs of Spanish surname students. And so with this, some of the specialized needs of these students would be, but are not limited to, bilingual programs, bicultural programs, the revision of assessment procedures, and also the recruitment of bilingual faculty and personnel. So not only were they targeting students' linguistic needs, but also their cultural needs. And he really was saying that with his ruling, he made it clear that school districts need to be sure that they have in place programs that really are directed towards the specialized needs of all of their students, including their Spanish surname students. What is it that these students may need that's different from other students? And this really was progressive for this time, because this is something that we're focusing on even now, is understanding how to serve your students, how to understand your students for where they are and what they need right now, versus what you think they need, or versus what you think may be best for them. You need to understand the specialized needs of your students and meet them where they are in order to be academically successful. In 1974, we have the case of Aspira versus New York City Board of Education. This is one of the biggest cases in bilingual education history, so it's really important to know. So make sure you're familiar with this case. An overview of the case is that Aspira, which is a community organization in New York, filed a complaint on behalf of English learners enrolled in New York City public schools. They were representing all English learners, and the case was filed on behalf of all English learners enrolled in New York City public schools, but Aspira was predominantly working with Puerto Rican students who were native Spanish speakers, and that's where the English learner population was heavily concentrated. Now, while this case was being heard, the ruling in the Lau v. Nichols case was handed down, and we'll talk about Lau v. Nichols in just a second. So with Lau v. Nichols established a precedent for serving English learners. And so with that, when that precedent was established kind of in the middle of this case was then kind of put to bed, litigation was ended, and it ended in what was called a consent decree. And so with a consent decree, what it basically means is that the organization who's being sued, so the New York City Board of Education, came to the plaintiffs and settled with them and met the demands that they were being asked to meet, as opposed to continuing this litigation and this argument in court. Again, we'll talk about Lau v. Nichols, which is another huge case in bilingual education, in just a second. But it's important to know that this Aspira case and this consent decree really did establish the rights of English learners in New York City. And this is kind of a citywide effort. And the population of English learners in New York City is a large population. It's very, very concentrated. And this consent decree did so much to help to protect the rights of those students. Specific rights, specific policies, very prescribed efforts, and not just kind of overview of policies like has been seen before. It really did establish, what schools needed to be doing and how they needed to serve students. There was a citywide assessment of English learners, and there was implementation of transitional programs for English learners as they were more effective. So with this, there was a promotion of programs that utilize students' first language because they were more effective, as opposed to other litigation, other policies that have been in place for English learners. This one really targeted and said you have to use their first language to help them transition to their second, because it is in fact more effective. Other policies before this one were just very broadly saying, schools need to take affirmative steps to ensure that the needs of English learners are being met. Again, it's very broad. This consent decree was so successful in helping English learners because of the fact that it was so prescriptive. So it really did serve as a model for other districts, and again, other districts that wanted to, or other districts to help to build their bilingual programs, but also other organizations who wanted to bring up any kind of litigation because they felt that their students and their English learners were being underserved. They used the Aspira consent decree to be able to model what they were doing or how they were going to bring the case about. This case was so big that some in the legal profession do refer to it as the Brown v. Board for language minority students, saying that just like Brown v. Board ended segregation and the steps that it helped, minority students take in terms of race and the barriers that it helped to break down in terms of ending the federal protection of segregation, this Aspira decree helped language minority students, English learners, to break down the barriers that really prohibited them from being able to access equitable service in their educational spaces. So in 1974, while Aspira was going on, the Lau v. Nichols case was also being heard. This, again, is one of the most important cases in bilingual education. It was a huge case in bilingual education. The steps that it helped take forward and kind of the lasting effects that it had are talked about even to this day. So a case overview. Lau v. Nichols was a class action suit filed on behalf of 1,790 Chinese American students who were academically unsuccessful because their language needs were not being met in their California public schools. And so again, there's a case concerning the actual services that language minority students were getting. And so the case claimed that this was actually a violation of not only the 14th Amendment, but also their rights protected under the Civil Rights Act. Now, the San Francisco Unified School District, who was being sued in the case, stated that they were actually not in violation because the resources that they provided the Chinese American students who were English learners were exactly the same resources provided to all the other students. So they said, well, they're getting equal treatment, they're getting equal resources, they have the same teachers, they're in the same classrooms. How are we violating their 14th right amendments, or their rights under the 14th Amendment and their rights protected under the Civil Rights Act? They're getting everything that all other students are getting. And so the ruling in the case was actually, again, in favor of the plaintiffs, the 1,790 Chinese American students who were English learners. And the judge in his ruling specifically said that there was actually no equity of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English, they are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. So what the judge, his ruling really stated was that English learners have a specialized need. Their needs are not the same as other students. And if the resources that they're being provided with, including facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum, do not target those special needs, then they're actually being foreclosed from any quote unquote meaningful education. They don't have access to the education because the resources that they have do them no good. What good does a textbook or a teacher or a curriculum that is only in English, what good is it for a student who speaks no English? And so with this initial ruling in favor of the plaintiffs only really mandated that districts were to provide meaningful education. So this initial ruling was that found the San Francisco Unified School District in violation and said, you know what, there needs to be a meaningful education provided for English learners. What this turned into were the 1975 Lau remedies, and then that was actually again reauthorized in 1980 to be the Lau regulations. So the initial ruling in Lau v. Nichols was for the Chinese American English learner students. Again, the judge ruled that there needed to be meaningful education for language learners. And so the way this was to be done were the prescribed Lau remedies in 1975 that came into policy, and then the Lau regulations that came in 1980. So let's go ahead and look at what those looked like. So as a result of the 1974 Lau v. Nichols case, the 1975 Lau remedies were created by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And so what these remedies were was they were set as compliance standards. Now, the Bilingual Education Act at the time in 1975 only applied to schools receiving federal funding. And remember, when the Bilingual Education Act first came into federal policy, it was seen as a discretionary or competitive program. So schools could use it if they wanted to. If not, don't worry about it. The Lau remedies, on the other hand, were actually set as compliance standards. And they said school districts have to do these things, have to utilize these approaches, methods, and procedures for working with English learners in these capacities. So the Lau remedies actually outlined, again, approaches, methods, and procedures for the identification and evaluation of English learners, for the determination of best instructional methods, for exiting English learners from existing bilingual programs, and for teacher professional responsibilities and development. And so in setting these compliance standards in place, now districts had actually prescriptive methods to help guide what they were supposed to be doing. Some districts loved this. Some districts loved the help. They loved knowing exactly what they were responsible for doing. Others were not so happy with it. But the Lau remedies were huge in bilingual education because really it was the first time that actual prescriptive methods were put into place. More specific policy was put into place. Best practices were written into federal policy. Again, with the Lau remedies, they were so important that later they were actually written into a federal law. So here you just have compliance. So a school could be in compliance or out of compliance. Later, when it's written into federal law with the Equal Opportunity Education Act, it's going to have much more of a punch, because one thing is if a school district is out of compliance, and it's quite another thing if a school district is actually in violation of a federal law. So in 1980, there was a reauthorization of the Lau remedies, and in 1980 it was actually turned into the Lau regulations. And so with these Lau regulations, they were put into the Equal Opportunity Education Act, and they started to have much more of a weight that went with them. They carried a legal standing. The remedies were only seen as compliance, and they were overseen by the Office of Civil Rights. On the other hand, the 1980 Lau regulations carried legal standing because they were written into federal policy under the Equal Opportunity Education Act. They were much more prescriptive than the Lau remedies, and the Lau regulations actually mandated bilingual instruction for districts with more than 25 speakers of the same language in 2 consecutive grades. So let's unpack this for a little bit. So let's say that you have students in Bexar County, and with this, within Bexar County, let's say San Antonio Independent School District. It mandated bilingual instruction for districts with more than 25 speakers of the same language in 2 consecutive grades. So if San Antonio ISD looked at their student enrollment and saw, hey, you know what? We have 40 Russian speakers, and we have 40 students who speak Russian as their native language. And we have, with these 40 students, we have 10 in first grade, 10 in second grades, and 10 in third grades. Because there are, for one, more than 25 speakers, there are 40 speakers who speak Russian natively in 2 consecutive grades. So because they're in first grade, second grade, and third grade, San Antonio ISD would then, under the law regulations, have been mandated to enact a bilingual education Russian English program for their students who are native Russian speakers. Okay. Now, if they had 40 speakers who spoke Russian as their native language, and there were 10 in first grade and 6 in fifth grade, and so on and so forth, as to where they were spread out amongst grades and the grades were not consecutive, they then did not have to enact a bilingual education program. This is something that's going to stick around in the state of Texas. We're going to see this again when we start talking about Chapter 89, which is Texas' current policy for educating language learners. But this is the first time that it was seen in policy at all, was this 25 or more number in 2 consecutive grades, and this really becoming the standard for whether or not a district needed a bilingual program or not. This in looking at, if you have 25 speakers of the same language in 2 consecutive grades, this really speaks to immigration patterns. And so if you have 25 speakers of the same native language in 2 consecutive grades, it really will start to tell you, okay, maybe this is an immigration pattern that we're starting to see. We have more people immigrating to the United States, to San Antonio ISD, for example, from Russia. So that's why we're seeing this population of students start to grow. But again, the law regulations were definitely more prescriptive than the law remedies, and they carried more of a legal standing. Unfortunately, with the law regulations and them coming into federal policy, it was an effort by President Carter that was really spearheaded, something he wanted to see happen. But when the new Reagan administration entered into office after President Carter, it was actually repealed. And so the weight that the law regulations held was repealed, and it was only utilized in a case-by-case basis. And so it really did lose its legal standing and its power, if you will. So that was unfortunate. In 1974, the Equal Opportunity Education Act was put in place because of the rulings that were found in the Keys versus Colorado case and the Lau versus Nichols case. Remember that Keys versus Colorado was actually on the topic of segregation, and Lau v. Nichols was the education of English learners. Now, the Equal Opportunity Education Act was actually just an amendment of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESA, which, remember, was part of President Johnson's quote-unquote war on poverty. So an amendment to this act was the Equal Opportunity Education Act that was brought about because of these cases. Policymakers really started to see that more and more cases were coming up that concerned things like segregation, the education of English learners. They started to see that existing policies just weren't enough. So it needed to be, again, just a little bit more specific. And so the Equal Opportunity Education Act specifically prohibited de facto segregations, and this outlined that schools could not deny equal educational opportunity based on race, color, gender, or national origin. And de facto segregation really is like, oh, okay, well, maybe it's just segregation that just happened, naturally because of location barriers, or this just happened to be the way it worked out. And so it forced schools to really start to look at where their current practices and current policies actually helping segregation happen. Were they promoting segregation, whether they intended it or not to? When something is done de facto, it may be done intentionally or not, but with de facto, it really kind of gives that question of perhaps it was intentional, but even if it wasn't intentional, it's still happening. And so it still held schools liable and gave them some responsibility and said whether it was intentional or whether it was unintentional, you still cannot do it. And so that's what the Equal Opportunity Education Act did. And with this Equal Opportunity Education Act, this is what helped the Lao remedies and the Lao regulations get into federal policy, was because under the ruling of Lau v. Nichols and the mandate for schools to provide a quote unquote meaningful education that the judge issued the ruling under, if schools were not abiding by the Lau regulations, they were then denying equal education opportunity based on one of these things. So because of that, that's how this was able to be worked into federal policy. But again, the Lau regulations were repealed under the Reagan administration. So again, we see that shifting of the pendulum for support or lack of support for bilingual education based on political affiliation and who really is in the White House, what their agenda is, what their ideals are. In 1981, we have the case of Castañeda versus Pickard. And so again, this is one of the heavy-hitting cases in bilingual education, one of the most important cases in bilingual education. After you had the Espira consent decree, after you had the Lau v. Nichols case, again, you still had schools who were out of compliance, who were not serving language learners like they should have been. So this is, again, a foundational case in bilingual education because of the policy that resulted from it. In this case, plaintiffs claimed that a Texas school district in Raymondville, Texas, was falling short of meeting their children's needs that were protected under the Equal Education Opportunity Act. So again, here you see policy coming up and then cases who are brought about in front of the court saying that the policy that was written was in violation. So you have the Equal Education Opportunity Act written and put into place, and then you have a case come up saying, wait a minute, my students' rights are being infringed that are protected under this policy. And so again, the plaintiffs were claiming that their students were not being served in their Texas school district in Raymondville, Texas, and the students were English learners. They were saying that their classrooms were segregated and that there was a failure to establish an effective bilingual education program. The judge in this case actually ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and the court established a detailed ruling of effectively serving English learners. So not only did the court find that the Raymondville, Texas school district was not meeting the needs of English learners, it also passed down a detailed ruling of how to effectively serve English learners, which was really, really important in bilingual education. And this ruling is known as the Castañeda Standard. And so with this Castañeda Standard, what it says is that bilingual education programs must be developed on sound research, be structured with adequate resources, and provide opportunities for students to have access to the full curriculum. So with this, again, you have some rulings on bilingual education, some prescriptive standards, but again, they were very broad. So for example, let's take the first one. A program must be developed on sound research. Well, who's to determine what sound research is? You can, again, really make research say whatever you want it to. It's just all about presentation. Again, this is one of those things of like, okay, well, this standard is better than nothing. But again, they was criticized because of the broad nature of it, and it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. However, this standard was important because it was used in conjunction with the Lau remedies in a case-by-case basis once they were repealed from their federal kind of weight that they had. The Castañeda standard really helped to kind of back those up. So what you start seeing now is more and more and more federal policy that gets more specific and more specific about how to best serve English learners. And what you're starting to see is just a change in the ideal of English learners, and people are really starting to recognize that English learners have a specialized need that needs to be met, and that granting them just access to education overall in general isn't enough. As the ruling found in Lau v. Nichols showed, if you give them access to education that they don't understand, you might as well not give them anything at all. And so you have more and more federal policy coming into place that's really outlining best practices for English learners. But again, this policy is always just a bit too broad and leaves quite a bit of room for interpretation. In 1981, you have the case of the United States versus Texas. This is a landmark case, especially in the state of Texas, because it resulted in the Texas educational law, which is now Chapter 89, which is still in place. This complaint was brought before the court as a result of alleged mistreatment and segregation of Mexican American students in the state of Texas. To give this a little context, it's important to remember again how Texas became part of the United States. There are so many students of Mexican ancestry and Spanish-speaking students in the state of Texas because remember, Texas once upon a time was Mexico. The citizens woke up overnight and boom, they were American citizens. Nothing that they did, the border was moved. And so because of this, overnight, they were American citizens. They were now part of this new nation, this new country, but the culture and the language and the history still ran very deep. Because of this and because of the way that Texas became part of the United States, this portion of Mexico, rather, became part of the United States. Texas and specifically Mexicans and people of Mexican heritage in the state of Texas have always had this kind of vilified stamp on them. Once upon a time, long, long ago, during the Mexican-American War, they were the enemy. But overnight, boom, they were part of the United States, and they were never really given a clean slate. People did never really give it a chance. It was always this idea, again, of us versus them always kind of remained and lingered over those of Mexican ancestry and heritage in the state of Texas. Judge William Wayne ruled in favor again of the plaintiffs and said that Texas schools were in fact segregating students to inferior schools, vilifying the native language of Spanish, and vilifying the Mexican culture. They were painting it all in a very, very negative light. If you know of anybody who went to school during the late 70s, early 80s, and even before that, ask them what their school experience was like as a student from Mexican heritage. This is a big reason why you will see a language gap in families. So if whoever you have that grew up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the state of Texas, if that person was speaking Spanish, once that person had kids, very rarely did they pass the language on to their kids because of the vilification that they felt in schools. This isn't something that was made up. This isn't stories that your tia tells you. This actually happened. And there was a huge ruling against the state of Texas because of this, and the entire state of Texas because of this. And so because of that, that's a lot of times why you see the Spanish language die in families that have been in the state of Texas for a while. So if this is the case in your family, if you were the person who didn't get the Spanish passed down to you, go and look to see at what point did the language die. In what point in your family does somebody is the last, for example, bilingual person, at what point in your family was the last person taught Spanish? And then figure out, were they in school before or after this case? And even if they were in school a little bit after this case, it'll still speak volumes to you because, again, you see how long it takes things to be passed down, how long it takes rulings to be passed down. And unfortunately, we still do very much see this vilification of the Spanish language and Mexican culture in the state of Texas. So as a result of this landmark case, this ruling resulted in the creation of a bilingual task force that later drafted Senate Bill 477, which is the Bilingual Texas Education Law. It's also known as Chapter 89 and is still in place today, and we'll talk about it later on in the course, but it outlines how to specifically serve English learners in the state of Texas, and that is in place today because of this landmark case. So in 1994, as we saw the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the last reauthorization of this act by the Clinton administration, within that reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, there was a lot of support for dual language education. And bilingual education. But because of this reauthorization, what starts to happen when you have a lot of progressive policies like this is you start to see a backlash from states because sometimes states who don't necessarily support these federal initiatives start to see like, okay, well, what can we do to work against that? And so in this case, it started to be a backlash against immigrant populations, bilingual students, So the 1994 California Proposition 187 was actually titled the Save Our State Proposition, and it intended at drastically reducing the rights and services available to undocumented residents and migrant workers in the state of California. This was passed, and what it started to nod towards and what we started to see was actually a push for English only initiatives in schools. So in 1998, Proposition 227 was passed with overwhelming support in the state of California. And Proposition 227 was the English for the Children proposition. The way it came about, a software developer in California whose name was Ron Unz strongly believed in the idea of assimilation over acculturation. So again, he supported propositions like Prop 187, which really did just reduce the rights and services available to undocumented citizens. Excuse me. And so he really started to put his money behind Proposition 227. It's interesting because he was a software developer. He had no background in education, certainly not a background in bilingual education. But what he was doing was running this campaign to support Proposition 227 on the idea of assimilation versus acculturation. And you see this happen a lot of times with bilingual education. It's not necessarily about what is theoretically sound in terms of language learning, but more so what aligns with the ideals of assimilation versus acculturation. So in 1998, when Proposition 227 was passed, this ended bilingual education in California in favor of English-only programs. And so all programs in the state of California defaulted to English-only programs. The very few bilingual programs that remained were either one, utilizing a student's first language for a very limited time for transitional purposes, or two, painted in an extremely negative light and made parents kind of jump through a bunch of hoops of signing all these waivers, and really just painted them in a negative light and made parents question the appropriateness and effectiveness of bilingual education. This was a big hit for the state of California, and we'll see later kind of the negative effects that happened. But what started with this passing of Proposition 227 is we started to see this English-only initiative just move across the United States and really take its effect on a lot of other states after that. In 2000, for example, a couple years later, Arizona Proposition 203, and then 2002, Massachusetts Question 2 mandated English-only instruction across the state. And again, these efforts were led and also financed. That's an important part of it because he ran campaigns for these. He put his money behind this. They were led and financed by software developer Ron Unz, who opposed bilingual education. So here again, you have somebody who's not necessarily running this campaign against bilingual education based on best practices for language learners, but more so the idea of assimilation and being in favor of assimilation over acculturation. Kind of in the midst of all this, in 2001, the No Child Left Behind Act was drafted and passed by the George W. Bush administration. This act replaced the long-standing Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And as part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it also replaced Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was the Bilingual Education Act. So now No Child Left Behind replaced the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and the Bilingual Education Act was replaced with Title III. Under No Child Left Behind, there was very limited support for bilingual education, majority focus on English acquisition, and it redefined what a quote-unquote highly qualified teacher was. So this resulted in new qualification for teachers and new certification tests. One of the biggest things that the No Child Left Behind Act did was introduce this idea of assessment, reporting, and adequate yearly progress, or AYP. This is really when testing in states, federal reporting, federal testing took off. This is when the tax test was introduced. Before, I think it was the TOS test, and then it was the tax test, and then the STAR was also developed under No Child Left Behind. And this is really when states started to be required federally, on a federal level, to test students, to report testing grades, to report testing results to disaggregate students into different populations, to just look at just tons and tons and tons of data, to collect tons of testing data. And this really is when the wave of testing was introduced on a federal level. As No Child Left Behind was replaced, some states still held on to this. So, for example, the state of Texas is a big testing state still, although they're not required to. And a lot of people are really comfortable with this idea of testing because of the fact that people who don't necessarily understand education may understand numbers. And a lot of teachers have issues with that because we know that numbers don't always speak to what's going on in our classrooms. So let's say that somebody were to look at Mrs. Lotta's STAR results for her third grade math class, and only 60% of my students passed. But they only see those numbers. They only see that 60% of my students passed, 40% failed, and 20 of those 40% were far behind. They don't necessarily get the story that of the 100% of students that came in, 100% of them were more than 2 grade levels behind in math. They don't necessarily know or understand all of the contextual issues. They don't necessarily know that 20% of my students may have severe behavioral plans put in place. And so with that, that's what's really frustrating for teachers, is these numbers don't always tell the stories of the classrooms of schools. But with the federal involvement in education, that's the implication. You have people who don't necessarily understand education, understand classrooms, people who don't even know what teaching is about, or who have never stepped foot in a classroom other than being a student themselves, making these regulations. If schools under No Child Left Behind did not meet what was set as their adequate yearly progress 5 years in a row, the federal government would come in and take over the school, make all the teachers reapply for their jobs, interview people, restaff the school without understanding the context of the school district, without understanding the context of the neighborhood that the school was placed in, or the student population. All they were looking at was the data and these numbers. So a big thing to remember about No Child Left Behind is it was huge on assessment and reporting, and really did introduce these ideas that just lingered long after it was done. In 2015, the Every Student Succeed Act was drafted and passed by the Obama administration, and it effectively replaced No Child Left Behind. With the Every Student Succeed Act, it started to emphasize state and local control over testing and reporting. So it completely took out the federal government's involvement in state and local decisions and started giving these rights back to the state. However, Texas, still being a very heavy testing state, still kept some of those policies and ideas about testing and reporting. The Every Student Succeed Act also introduced the college and career readiness standards, which before really weren't in place. And the Every Student Succeed Act brought back the importance placed on career readiness standards. So not just college for everybody, but also technical programs that focused on careers after K-12 education, and not just pushing students into college. There was also, within the Every Student Succeed Act, new terminology was distinguished for English language learners. So before the Every Student Succeed Act, the federal terminology for English learners was limited English proficient student. In any federal policy, that's what you would see. What replaced this was English learners, because lawmakers felt that the term limited English proficient focused on what students were not able to do and put them in a negative light. So instead, the term English learner was replaced in all federal policy. There were also more long-term goal settings and monitoring of English learner progress. So students were now to be monitored for 4 years after they exited programs, instead of only for 2 years. This also allotted for state funding for English learners and required that English language proficiency standards be set for all states. Texas already did this. Texas had English language proficiency standards in place long before the Every Student Succeed Act, because this was something that the state of Texas had to do to meet the needs of the rising English learner populations. But other states that didn't perhaps have as large English learner populations didn't have these English language proficiency standards. So under this piece of federal legislation, it required states to have these to be sure that they were meeting the needs and serving their English learner population to the best of their ability. So again, with the Every Student Succeed Act, you see kind of a removal of federal authority in state and public education. They're granting control back over to states and local agencies over how are you going to test? What are you going to test? How are you going to report what you're testing? It's still requiring states and districts and local districts to report their testing and report their scores and assessments, but it's allowing them to decide that on their own of how they're going to report, and it gives some wiggle room for what is reported. They do have some standards set, but there are a couple of other things where they say, okay, well, you can choose how to disaggregate your student data in these ways, and you can choose these subpopulations to report. More than anything, though, there really is a renewed support for English learners. Again, there's more long-term goal setting and monitoring for English learners after they are exited from traditional programs. There's more funding for them, and overall, they're just painting English learners in just a better light by saying, no, they're not limited English proficient. They're just simply English learners. Along the lines of this, after this Every Student Succeed Act and this new federal policy was put in place, and there was kind of a resurgence of support for English learners, we start to actually see that these English only mandates that were put in place in several states were repealed. So in 2016, California Proposition 58 repealed Proposition 227 and implemented California's Multilingual Educational Act of 2016. Also in 2017, you had the Massachusetts Look Act, the Language Opportunity for Our Kids Act. And the Massachusetts Look Act in 2017 repealed Massachusetts Question 2. All of these align with the Every Student Succeed Act. And so with the repeal of Proposition 227, California's Proposition 58 started to allow for dual language programs and provisions in and outside of California public schools without this need for parental waivers, without this negative lighting painted on them. And also Proposition 58 called for more parent and public involvement in the enactment of these dual language programs. So they really wanted to start to target the bicultural needs of students as well. With the Proposition 58, it's California's having a lot of issues rebuilding their bilingual education programs, because with Proposition 227 that basically killed bilingual education in the state. Not only did it kill it at the K-12 public education level, but also in higher education. If bilingual education was not allowed in California, you saw programs in higher education start to die as well. So California at the time is really struggling to rebuild their bilingual education programs, because they're having to get all new resources, build programs to certify teachers, build higher education programs for pre-service teachers, build programs for in-service teachers. They're really having to start from the ground up because of the policies that had been in place for so long that did away with bilingual education and all the resources that came with it. As well as Massachusetts, the Look Act is heavily aligned to the Every Student Succeed Act, in that it replaced limited English proficient at the local level with English learner, as did California Proposition 58. And the Massachusetts Look Act, like Prop 58, supports dual language programs, and also they both support a seal of biliteracy. So painting bilingual ability in a positive light, with allowing students to graduate with this distinction, saying, oh my gosh, they have this seal of biliteracy. They're not only academically proficient and ready to graduate, but they're also biliterate, which means they can listen, speak, read, and write in 2 languages. So they're actually making it a distinguished honor for students to graduate with this ability. All right, and that is going to do it for our content presentation. So throughout this content presentation, our objective really was for you to look at and review major world and U.S. historical events, litigation, and federal policies that have impacted ESL bilingual education. We looked at several different pieces of big litigation that happened throughout the course of ESL bilingual history across the United States, and specifically Texas. We looked at how these pieces of litigation were enacted, how these rulings helped to create policy, and kind of the influx of policy and how policy was replaced. And more than anything, we looked at how just the changing times and the enactment of policy really shaped bilingual education. And more than anything, it's important to know that it's so many external factors support bilingual education and what happens in bilingual education and funding for it and how it's painted. And unfortunately, these issues that shape how bilingual education is painted and whether or not it receives funding, again, have nothing to do with the idea of doing what's best for students, but rather conforming to the ideas of assimilation versus acculturation, which is how we really began this discussion of history. So it's important to know that when something happens in history, look to see, is it aligning with the idea of assimilation or acculturation, and go back to historical events and be able to pinpoint, why is this happening? And what you're going to start to see is it happens in a cyclical nature. You have a whole bunch of support for bilingual education, and then all of a sudden the pendulum just swings the other way. And so these policies and these pieces of litigation are really handed down through the court system, and they affect teachers in classrooms. And sometimes it's hard for teachers to keep up with this. So if you know somebody who's been in the field of education for quite a while, ask them, hey, do you remember when bilingual education was outlawed? If, for example, if you have a teacher who's been teaching in California public schools for 25 years, this teacher has seen support for bilingual education completely doing away with it and outlawing it, and then now there's a support for bilingual education again. So it's important to know how historical events really do shape what we're doing in our classrooms. And that's going to do it for our discussion. I'll talk to you guys soon.